My brother called me the morning our father's will was being read, and the first thing he said wasn't "How are you holding up?" or "I can't believe he's gone." It was, "Don't bring your lawyer. I'm a paralegal." I've spent 6 years watching people say the quiet parts out loud when they think no one's paying attention. That sentence, "before coffee, before I'd even put shoes on," told me everything I needed to know about the next few hours. My father passed 11 days before that call. Pancreatic cancer, fast and unforgiving, the kind that gives you 4 months from diagnosis to funeral and doesn't apologize for the inconvenience. He was 67. He still fixed his own gutters. He still made his own pasta from scratch on Sundays. He was not supposed to go like that, and I think none of us had fully landed back on Earth yet when the attorney's office called to schedule the reading. My father's name was Raymond. He was not a complicated man. He worked 34 years in civil engineering, loved the Cubs even when it physically hurt him, and believed that a person's word was the only currency that actually mattered. He raised 3 kids on that philosophy. Me, my older brother, and my younger sister, Nadia, who died from a car accident when she was 24. That's important. Remember that. After Nadia died, my father changed his will. He told me this directly sitting on the back porch 2 weeks before his diagnosis, because he trusted me to understand the legal language he didn't. He said he was setting aside a portion of his estate specifically for a foundation in Nadia's name, a scholarship fund for first-generation college students. It wasn't a fortune. Maybe $80,000. But it was intentional. It was his way of giving her a continued presence in the world. He told me. He did not tell my brother. My brother's name is Marcus. He is 4 years older than me, lives 40 minutes away in a house that costs more than he can reasonably afford on a middle manager's salary, and married a woman named Vivienne 7 years ago who has never once in 7 years asked me a question about my life that wasn't followed immediately by a segue back to herself. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it's relevant. Marcus and Vivienne had been helping my father during the last stretch of his illness, driving him to appointments, picking up prescriptions, dropping off meals, and I had been grateful. I lived further away, worked longer hours, and I couldn't always get there in time. I told Marcus that regularly. I told him I appreciated it. I made the mistake of meaning it without verifying what it was costing him to give it. The attorney's name was Philip Hartley. His office was in a beige building near downtown that smelled like carpet cleaner and old paper. I arrived 8 minutes early and sat in the waiting room with a cup of coffee that tasted like burnt ambition. Marcus and Vivienne arrived together, Vivienne in a blazer that was too formal for grief and too expensive for someone who should have been mourning. Marcus looked pale, jaw tight, the kind of tight that happens when you've been rehearsing something for days. He leaned over to me before Mr. Hartley came out and said, quietly, like we were sharing something, "Dad told me he was updating the will before he got sick. I don't want any surprises today." I looked at him. I said, "He did update it." He nodded once, like he already knew that, which meant he knew more than he was pretending to. Mr. Hartley read the will in the careful, measured voice attorneys use when they've seen families fall apart over paperwork before, and they'd rather not watch it happen again. The house went to me and Marcus equally, to be sold and divided. The remaining savings were split 3 ways. 1/3 to Marcus, 1/3 to me, and 1/3 to Nadia's scholarship foundation, which my father had already established with a local community college as the beneficiary. Marcus's face, when that last part was read, looked like a man watching a flight he'd already boarded get redirected to the wrong city. Vivienne put her hand on his arm. He didn't move. I watched their exchange in my peripheral vision, the way I watch everything. Quietly, cataloging. They didn't look surprised exactly. They looked recalculating. There's a difference. Surprised people show it for a second and then process. Recalculating people go immediately to strategy. Their eyes move. Vivienne's eyes moved to me before Marcus's did. Outside the office, Marcus pulled me aside. His voice had dropped into the register he uses when he wants to seem reasonable while making an unreasonable request. He said the foundation didn't make sense, financially speaking. He said Dad hadn't been thinking clearly near the end, that the cancer and the medications had affected his judgment, and that honestly, for the sake of the family, maybe we should talk to Hartley about contesting. I kept my voice very flat. I said, he told me about the foundation 2 weeks before his diagnosis. He was perfectly clear. Marcus said, "You're always doing this." I said, "What am I doing?" He walked to the car. Vivienne paused just long enough to give me a look that was half pity and half warning before following him. I stood on the sidewalk outside a beige building and thought about my father making pasta on Sundays and whether he'd known at the end that this was coming. I drove home and sat in my kitchen for an hour without turning on any lights. The call I didn't expect came 4 days later. It was from a woman named Ellen Park, and she introduced herself as my father's primary care physician. She said she was sorry for my loss, that my father had been a patient she genuinely cared about, and that she was calling because he had asked her to in the event that he passed and certain circumstances arose. I said, "What circumstances?" She paused. Then she said, "He told me that if anyone in his family ever questioned his mental state or tried to challenge his final wishes on grounds of diminished capacity, I should call you. He wanted someone to have his cognitive assessments on record." She had documentation. Dated, witnessed evaluations, multiple sessions from the 8 months before he died, during which my father had been tested for cognitive function, memory retention, and executive decision-making. He had scored above average for his age in every category. He had known exactly what he was doing. He had, it turned out, been quietly building a case for himself before he was gone because he had guessed, correctly, that someone might try to tear it apart after. My father was a civil engineer. He understood load-bearing structures. He knew that if something was going to hold weight, you had to build a foundation before anyone could see it. I asked Dr. Park how long she'd been sitting on this information. She said since a month before he died. She said my father had specifically asked her not to reach out unless it became necessary. "It became necessary pretty quickly," I said. She said, "I know. That's why I'm calling now." After we hung up, I sat very still in my office chair and thought about the fact that my father had anticipated being doubted by his own son and had quietly arranged for someone to defend him from the grave. That hit differently than grief. Grief I'd been managing in pieces. This felt like something else. It felt like my father handing me a tool and trusting me to use it correctly. I called Hartley that afternoon. I told him Marcus had floated the idea of contesting the will on grounds of diminished capacity. Hartley was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you have documentation of your father's cognitive state?" I said, "I do now." He said, "Good. Keep it." I forwarded Dr. Park's documents to my personal email, my work email, and a cloud backup I hadn't touched in 3 years. Then I printed hard copies and put them in a folder in my filing cabinet behind a tab labeled Utilities, because nobody ever looks in Utilities. Marcus called that night. He didn't mention the will contest directly. He asked if I was okay. He asked how work was going. He asked if I'd been in touch with any of Dad's friends because he wanted to coordinate thank you notes. It was the kind of conversation that sounds like nothing and is actually reconnaissance. I answered everything briefly and waited. Near the end of the call he said, casually, like it was an afterthought, "Oh, also, Vivian looked into the foundation thing. Apparently the transfer to the community college hasn't finalized yet. We might have a window to redirect it if we move fast." I said, "Redirect it where?" He said, "It doesn't have to go to some institution we don't even know. It could stay in the family. For the kids." Marcus did not have kids. "For the future." I said, "Marcus, that money is Nadia's." Silence. He said, "She's gone, Laurel. That's my name. Laurel. It's not like she can use it." I let the line sit quiet for long enough that it became uncomfortable. Then I said, "Good night, Marcus," and I hung up. I didn't sleep well. I laid in the dark and thought about Nadia, who had been 24 and driving home from a late shift and hit by someone running a red light. I thought about my father, who had made pasta every Sunday for the rest of his life after she died. Always a little too much. Always leaving some in the fridge like she might show up and be hungry. I thought about what it meant that Marcus could look at that $80,000 and see an opportunity rather than a memorial. The next morning I called the Community College Foundation office and asked if the transfer had finalized. The woman I spoke to said it was in process, but not yet complete. There was a 30-day administrative window. I asked what would happen if a family member tried to interfere with a transfer during that window. She said she'd have to loop in their legal team. I said, "Loop them in now. I'm telling you, it may be necessary." She paused. Then, understood. Over the next week, I put together a file, not dramatically, not in a panic, methodically. The way I work, because I spent 6 years watching attorneys win and lose cases on the quality of their documentation. I pulled every email Marcus had sent my father in the last year of his life. I went through the ones my father had forwarded to me when he was cleaning out his inbox. He did that sometimes, just sent me things for safekeeping without much explanation, and I never thought much about it until now. What I found was not subtle once you were looking. There were emails from Marcus suggesting my father was overwhelmed and should let us handle the financial stuff. Emails asking my father to sign over power of attorney, twice, in the months before his death, framed as making things easier. My father had declined both times. There was one email where Marcus mentioned, almost parenthetically, that the Scholarship Foundation was a nice gesture but maybe not the most practical use of the estate. My father had not responded to that one. Then I found the bank notification, forwarded to me by my father 9 months ago with no message, just the attachment. A withdrawal of $4,000 from a joint account he'd shared with Marcus for property expenses on the family cabin. The withdrawal location was 40 minutes from the cabin, 5 minutes from Marcus and Vivienne's house, dated on a Thursday morning. My father did not drive on Thursdays during that period. He had standing infusion appointments every Thursday for a clinical trial he was enrolled in, so my father had not made that withdrawal, but someone with joint account access had. I sat with that for a long time. Then I did what you do when you work in law. I called someone who actually practices it. My colleague's name is Bernard Walsh, and he's a kind of attorney who wears the same gray blazer every day and has won more elder financial abuse cases than anyone else in our city without ever once appearing to break a sweat. I told him everything. I brought the folder. He read through it slowly, not speaking, then looked up and said, "How much do you know about elder financial exploitation statutes in this state?" I said, "Enough to know I'm sitting in the right office." He said, "You are." Bernard filed a report with the state's Adult Protective Services Unit, not a lawsuit, not yet, a report which triggers an investigation, which creates a paper trail which makes it significantly harder for anyone to quietly redirect $80,000 before a court has had a chance to look at it. He also sent a formal letter to Marcus and Vivienne's attorney. They'd hired one, which told me they'd known this was coming, stating that any attempt to contest the will or interfere with the foundation transfer would be met with a counterfiling alleging financial elder abuse, supported by documentation. I found out about the attorney they'd hired because Vivienne called me. She didn't call to apologize. She called to tell me, in a voice that was carefully measured and slightly too warm, that she and Marcus were worried about me. That grief does things to people. That they loved me and didn't want to see me destroy relationships over a misunderstanding. She said the word misunderstanding 3 times in 4 minutes, which is not a word people use when they believe themselves to be innocent. Innocent people say that's not what happened. Guilty people say misunderstanding. I let her talk. I've sat in enough depositions to know that the most useful thing you can do when someone is lying to you is let them keep going. She said my father had been confused. She said my father had been confused. She said Marcus had been trying to protect the estate. She said the $4,000 was a reimbursement for expenses they'd covered, groceries, medications, gas, and that my father had approved it verbally. I said, "Do you have that in writing?" Beat. "He was our family," she said. "We didn't document everything we did for him." I said, "Bernard Walsh will be in touch," and I ended the call. Bernard requested records from the joint account going back 18 months. What came back was not a reimbursement. It was a pattern. 12 withdrawals over 14 months, small enough to avoid automatic bank alerts, timed during my father's Thursday appointments or overnight when he wouldn't notice immediately. Total, just over $19,000. My father had been sick and exhausted and trusting, and his own son had used all 3 of those things against him. Bernard submitted the full financial record to APS and copied the probate court. I submitted Dr. Park's cognitive assessments alongside it. Within 10 days, the probate court issued a protective order freezing any challenge to the will pending investigation. Marcus called me the night after the order was issued. He did not open with small talk this time. He said, "You went to APS." I said, "Yes." He said, "You're accusing me of stealing from our dying father." I said, "I'm providing documentation. Other people get to do the accusing." He said I was cruel. He said I had always made things harder than they needed to be. He said I didn't understand what it cost them, financially, emotionally, to show up for Dad the way they had, and that the account withdrawals were fair compensation, and that I was too far removed to have any standing to judge. I said, "Dad knew. He forwarded me the bank notification himself." The silence that followed was the longest one I'd heard from my brother in my entire life. 34 years, and I'd never heard him go that quiet. He said finally, he sent that to you. Not a question. I said, 9 months ago. Another silence. Then Vivian's voice in the background asking something I couldn't make out. Marcus said, away from the phone, he knew. Just that. Just that. Just he knew. I hung up. That was the last conversation I had with my brother before the formal proceedings began. Bernard advised me not to engage further, and I didn't. Not because I was afraid of what I'd say, but because there was nothing left that needed saying. My father had already said it and forwarded bank statements and foundation paperwork and cognitive evaluations and a will that was legally sound and morally clear. He had built the case. I had just followed it. The APS investigation took 4 months. The investigator, a woman with reading glasses she never actually put on her face, just interviewed me twice, Marcus and Vivian twice, Dr. Park, Hartley, 2 of my father's neighbors, and his pharmacist. She subpoenaed 18 months of bank records across 4 accounts. She was thorough in a way that made me feel, for the first time in a long time, like the system was doing what it was supposed to. The investigation substantiated elder financial exploitation. The withdrawals were not reimbursements. There was no verbal authorization documented anywhere. My father had not approved them. He had noticed them, forwarded the notification to me, and said nothing directly, because he was tired and sick and still hoping, I think, that his son would stop on his own. He didn't stop on his own. The probate court upheld the will in full. The foundation transfer to the community college completed, fully protected, legally sealed, untouchable. Nadia's scholarship fund exists now. First disbursement goes out this fall to 3 students who have no idea that the money came from a man who loved his daughter so much he left a piece of her in the world, even after he was gone. Marcus and Vivian agreed to a civil settlement to avoid criminal prosecution, repayment of the $19,400 plus legal fees, and a formal acknowledgement of the exploitation finding in the APS record. Bernard advised me to take the settlement. He said a criminal case would drag out longer than it was worth and cost me more than it cost them. I took it, not because I forgave them, but because my father's estate was whole, the foundation was funded, and I was done spending energy on people who had looked at a dying man and seen a withdrawal limit. There are things I think about now that I didn't let myself think about during the process. I think about how my father built his own defense before he died. Quietly, without telling me, trusting that I would find it if I needed to. I think about the Sunday pasta and the extra portion in the fridge. I think about how he forwarded that bank notification with no message, just the attachment, because he couldn't bring himself to say it out loud, but he needed me to have it. He knew what Marcus was doing, and he knew Marcus would try to take more after he was gone, and he spent his last month setting up a system of quiet protections because that was who he was. He built things to last. He always had. I still work in law. I still sit across tables from people who've been taken advantage of by the people closest to them. It's more common than anyone wants to believe. The ones who do it are rarely monsters in the way you'd expect. They're usually just people who needed money, told themselves they deserved it, and let the need grow quietly until it swallowed the line between family and asset. The people smiling at your dinner table can look you in the eye and take from you at the same time. I watched it happen to my father. He saw it happening to himself, and he trusted me to finish what he'd started, without making it about rage or revenge, just about the truth holding up under the weight of scrutiny. It held. The scholarship fund is called the Nadia Fund. The community college website has a page for it. Small, not flashy, just her name in a paragraph about what it's for. I look at it sometimes, not often, just when I need to remember that some things survive the people who built them. My father's pasta recipe is in a handwritten card in my kitchen drawer. I make it on Sundays now. I always make a little too much. People ask me sometimes if I'm angry. Not the polite kind of asking. The real kind, where they lean in a little and lower their voices like anger is something you have to whisper about. And honestly, the answer changes depending on the day. Some days I'm not angry at all. Some days I drive past the kind of house Marcus and Vivian live in, and something tightens in my chest that I don't have a cleaner word for. But here's what I keep coming back to. My father was not naive. He was an engineer. He understood, better than most people, that structures fail at their weakest point, and that the only way to prevent that is to reinforce it before the weight arrives. He watched his own son start skimming from a joint account while he was going to infusion appointments, and instead of confronting Marcus directly, instead of spending his last months in that particular kind of pain, he built something quietly. A cognitive evaluation here, a forwarded bank statement there, a doctor briefed and ready. He didn't have the energy to fight, so he made sure the truth would still be standing after he wasn't. That's the thing that stays with me most, not the betrayal. Betrayal is unfortunately just a category of human behavior, and I've worked in law long enough to know it doesn't require a monster, just a person who wanted something badly enough to stop asking whether they had the right to take it. What stays with me is my father's decision to spend some of his most limited, most exhausted days building protection for something he wouldn't live to see completed. That takes a specific kind of character. Not dramatic courage, the quieter kind. The kind that just keeps building even when it's tired. I think about what it costs Marcus to become someone who could do that. I don't mean financially, I mean what it costs a person internally to look at a sick father and see an account balance. That kind of thinking doesn't arrive overnight. It accumulates. Small justifications stacked on top of each other over years, each one a little heavier than the last, until the weight of it reshapes you into someone your family doesn't recognize. Marcus didn't wake up one morning and decide to steal from his dying father. He got there one rationalization at a time, and Vivian, I think she told herself they deserved it, that they'd earned it by showing up, that the work of caregiving entitled them to compensation nobody else had offered. Maybe they even believed it. That's the most unsettling part. People rarely think of themselves as the villain of their own story. I didn't want revenge. I want to be clear about that. What I wanted was for my father's intentions to survive him, for Nadia's fun to exist, for the thing he built to hold. And it did. Not because the system is always fair, not because good people always win, but because my father had the foresight to document the truth carefully enough that it couldn't be buried alongside him. He gave me the tools. My job was just not to drop them. If there's anything I'd want someone to take from this, it's that. Document things. Not because you're paranoid, but because clarity is a form of kindness, to yourself, to the people who come after you, to the truth you want to protect. And when someone you love is sick and vulnerable, pay attention to who orbits closest and what they reach for. People show you exactly who they are. The only question is whether you're willing to look. Nadia's Scholarship Fund sent its first 3 recipients letters this fall. I know because I asked the college to let me know when it happened. I didn't need anything else from that, just to know it was real. My father made pasta every Sunday for the rest of his life after she died. I make it now too. I always make a little too much.